we're at 1 p.m, so we will kick off. Kia ora everyone, ko Sylvie tōku ingoa. Lovely to see you all, or to hear from you all today at least. My name's Sylvie, I'm IHR's Chief Evangelist, and today's session is on interpersonal conflict in work and how we can respond to and manage those conflicts at work that can be a little bit uncomfortable when we deal with them. So we'll kick off with a bit of housekeeping as per usual. Now, we will be talking a little bit about some sensitive content today, so please keep today's discussions confidential. If any of this ends up on TikTok, I will be a bit grumpy and I will have to think about the ways that we do these going forward. But again, if there's a question that you want to share or something that you want kept confidential, just bear in mind that we will be having a cone of silence around the session, but again, that record will be available afterwards. Questions are very welcome. As always, these sessions really come alive when there's good engagement from the audience. I can absolutely speak to an empty room, but it's not very interesting for you guys or necessarily very interesting for me. So I really do welcome your questions. Use the Q&A function if you like. And what I'll do is I will gather all those questions together and answer them at the end of the session. So if there's anything that comes to mind as you go through, or if you'd rather hold your questions till the end, that's fine as well, just whatever you feel comfortable with. Now, a very, very minor content warning for today. I will be talking a little bit about bullying, a very little bit about harassment, and a bit about antisocial personality disorder. If any of those things are uncomfortable for you to be in the room to listen to, they'll be very, very quick and we will not spend much time there. But if you do need to take a breather and just take yourself away and come back, obviously I can't see you, so you can do whatever you like. But just a heads up that we will be discussing those issues a little bit today in the context of managing conflict at work. So to get us started and to get you guys used to participating, hopefully, I'd love to know what you're hoping to get out of this session. What was it that brought you along today? We know that conflict is something a lot of us experience pretty consistently at work. It's a bit of a feature of working with other people. So if you'd be comfortable, just in that Q&A function, send through something you're hoping to get out of today's session. And if you'd like to share your name and location as well. This is a Trans-Tasman webinar, so we've got people in New Zealand, we've got folks joining us from Australia. So if you'd like to say where you're joining us from, that just gives me a sense as to kind of who's here today and how I might help shape the examples and the conversation that we have so that you can get the most out of it. So while you are all sharing, again, as much as you would like to around what's brought you here today, let's cover off what to expect. So unsurprisingly, the first thing we'll talk about is what interpersonal conflict is, as well as what it isn't. It's really evident to me from the work that I've done with our clients over the last 10 years, certainly working as a coach in businesses, that conflict can show up in all kinds of areas. And just because something is uncomfortable doesn't mean it's conflict. So we'll talk a little bit about the differences there and what it is that we're talking about. We'll spend a bit of time looking at the drivers of conflict as well before talking about what happens in our brains when we are experiencing stress, when we're experiencing conflict, because we need to know what our brains are trying to do in order to respond meaningfully to the conflict that we're experiencing or that we're participating in. So we'll move on to how we can respond. We'll talk about the tools that we have, including a bit of a deep dive into courageous conversations. This is a model that is used very, very widely in all kinds of different contexts. And the reason I like it is because it has sections that can kind of be taken out of the entire Courageous Conversations framework itself. So rather than having to follow it from start to finish, there are little bits and pieces you can take away. Hopefully that will be useful to you in the situations that you're managing. We'll then talk about the bonus resources you'll get in the follow-up email once we've done the webinar. So there's a bit more for you if you'd like to do more research or do more work on this topic. Of course, we'll have plenty of time for questions and then we will wrap up and hopefully get you out of here at about 10 to 2 today. So we've got plenty of time. So coming back to our icebreaker, what I will do is jump out of the screen sharing and see if I can pull up the questions that have come through, because I can't see the messages from you guys when I'm screen sharing. I'm having some issues just accessing questions. Bear with me. Cool. Oh, I've had a whole bunch of messages come through saying that there's been some issues with the display. I think that's working now. Do let me know if you're having any other problems. But jump in. We have 177 participants today, which is fantastic. So thank you so much for coming along. Someone has said that they're here today to release tension between them and their boss. Thank you. That's a very brave thing to be sharing, and conflict between our bosses can be quite uncomfortable. Madison, kia ora Madison, thanks for coming along, is looking to improve her knowledge as a beginner P&C staff. Maggie's joining us from Auckland, from New Zealand. Kia ora Maggie, thank you for coming along today. Shirley would like to learn new skills to deal with conflict, to share that knowledge with others. Yeah. Anonymous has said dealing with one particular staff member who's very difficult to deal with. Yeah, that's pretty typical. We tend to have a bad egg who's causing us a lot of distress, and sometimes we end up spending that 80-20 rule. We spend 80% of our energy dealing with 20% of the problems because they're so difficult to navigate. Debbie has said looking for increased confidence and improved skills base to guide the interpersonal issues that come up. Nice one, Debbie. Thanks for sharing. Karen is from New South Wales. Kia ora, Karen. Thank you for coming along. Karen manages a team of people that don't always get on well, would like to know how to deal with conflict between the team and how not to let them upset me. Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Karen. I think there'll be some good tools for you here. Perfect. Some wonderful comments here. Thank you, everyone. That was a much more enthusiastic response than I was expecting. So I won't have time to go through them all, but just looking for some food for thought as a piece that comes through here, looking for guidance around how to deal with serious conflict, certainly dealing with difficult people in our lives. Yeah, all of that's coming through. A couple of people saying my screen sharing hasn't been working. I'm glad I caught that early because it was just the intro, but we can jump in and do that now. Difference between managing conflict issues between peers and staff and between kind of management and staff. Awesome, thank you. Perfect. Awesome. Well, I think we're all in the same place today. I'm confident there will be something for everyone to take away. Let me see if I can get that screen share working more effectively this time so that you all can see what I'm seeing. So I'm hoping on screen there is a picture of an iceberg on the right-hand side with icebreaker on the left-hand side. If I could get a couple of people just to say that that's coming through on the Q&A, that would be super helpful. Just before I carry on. Sharon saying all good. Yep, that looks like it's working now. Perfect. Thanks everyone for your patience. Cool. Well, before we get started then, we'll have a range of people joining us today. So I thought I'd just share a little bit about who My HR is. For those of you who've been to these webinars before, this will be familiar to you. So you're welcome to check Twitter or come back in a second. But My HR was established in 2013 and we're here to make HR easy. So we're an outsourced HR provider which covers all employment matters. That's everything from the proactive stuff like performance reviews and remuneration and pay strategy, people resourcing, all that kind of stuff, through to what I think of as the pointy end of HR. So disciplinaries, medical terminations, counselling, restructuring, all that kind of stuff. So there isn't a lot that we haven't seen. And because we have such a breadth of clients from every industry, we're often really well placed to help with those slightly weirder or strange issues that come up from time to time. The thing that sets us apart is not only are we a smart HR platform, so you have your My HR account with all of your people data, and that's where your processes live. So your e-signing of documents and policies, your people records, your people data. We also have a team of HR experts in the background who are here to help you with any of those weird issues. So the platform acts as the bridge between yourself and your business and us in the background. Not only can we jump in and help kind of set up that proactive stuff, where you do have an issue with a staff member or a person, you can call us and we're there in the background to write scripts for you, prepare bullet points for conversations, help you with conflict if that's something that you're dealing with, and make sure that you're compliant with your employment obligations, whether you're in New South Wales in Australia or whether you're in Tauranga in New Zealand. We now have over 1,450 clients that we support in New Zealand and Australia, which is fantastic. We're really proud of that growth. And we also opened in Canada in April, and so we've got 8 Canadian clients and we're growing the business over there too. Our businesses range from 1 employee to 750 staff is the largest business that we work with at the moment, and everything in between. So if you're thinking of retail, if you're thinking manufacturing, hospitality, professional services, trades, we work in all of those industries again, which puts us in a really good position to help with best practice HR and to make sure that you're managing compliance and business as usual in your business too. We don't have lock-in contracts. Again, the onus is on us to make sure that we're providing a really awesome service. If you don't like it, you're welcome to leave. But after 11 years of being in business, we're really proud of the fact that we're sitting at, kind of 1,450 clients in New Zealand and Australia. So we're confident the service speaks for itself. So having covered that off, let's dive into today's topic, which is interpersonal conflict. So, and this is a feature of working with other humans. Let me, at the very beginning of today's session, reassure you that if you are experiencing conflict at work, that is probably not a you problem necessarily. It's something that happens whenever you work with people in a space trying to get stuff done. So this can look like being unable to work productively or effectively with someone, just for whatever reason. It's really hard to find that chemistry or that rapport with them. Sometimes we avoid working with people because it's so uncomfortable, because it's not pleasant for us to be engaging with them. This can sound like aggressive comments or passive aggressive comments, either directly to them or in another direction. It can be raised voices, whether they're shouting, you tend to get quite het up in the conversations you're having, or it can be silence. You just freeze them out. You kind of don't say hi in the mornings. You won't invite them to the morning teas. You're just choosing to disengage from them because it's so stressful when you do work with them. Sometimes too, when you can keep it together working with them directly, you then have to have long debriefs afterward with a friend perhaps, or someone outside of work, or a trusted colleague, because it's so irritating dealing with them. You have to then take all that frustration, kind of put it somewhere else so that you can behave professionally with them. Just because there isn't kind of immediate problems in the relationship, clearly there is a conflict there because you keep having to vent or offload in a different context. And it can feel like frustration, it can feel like anger or disappointment, hurt sometimes if we feel like we're not being treated fairly or we had expectations that weren't met. And sometimes you can't put a finger on it, but you're just uncomfortable. There's just something about the way that that person shows up, or the way that they speak to you or to their colleagues, or the way that you see them kind of engage with others, that makes you ill at ease. So any of these kinds of examples are situations where there may or there's likely to be conflict at work. Now, what conflict isn't is a few things I thought we would cover off, especially because as we're dealing with increasing varieties of comfort with discomfort at work across different generations, it's important to talk about what interpersonal conflict isn't, because we can spend a lot of time dealing with those feelings when actually it's just part and parcel of doing business. So giving or receiving appropriate feedback is not interpersonal conflict. There is nothing wrong with giving your direct report feedback or receiving feedback from a superior. There is nothing wrong with giving someone some feedback about the way that they're behaving at work, as long as that's appropriate. So giving and receiving feedback appropriately is not conflict. It's just a part of us making sure that we're on the right course and behaving in ways that are appropriate for our team or for our business or for our customers, or if we need to kind of adjust what it is that we're trying to achieve at work. Feedback's a critical part of doing that. So feedback in and of itself isn't conflict. There are also plenty of examples of healthy conflict, whether this is having different approaches to solving the same problem, right? You're both looking at the same thing, but one of you might take a softer, slower approach, and one of you might take a harder, faster approach. That's perfectly healthy and normal. There's nothing wrong with that. There's not a problem here that we need to deal with. Robust discussions typically come up around commercial matters or around people matters. Again, having a really strongly voiced leadership team or a strongly voiced team in and of itself is an interpersonal conflict. Disagreeing about how to do something. I mean, if I had a dollar for every time I disagree with a colleague about how we should, do a presentation or run a meeting, I'd have many, many dollars and might be in Bali more of the year. Or having different priorities. Again, if you've got a finance team, a marketing team, an HR team, and an operations team, they're all going to have different things that they're prioritizing. And again, that's just a part of doing business where you have different groups who are trying to achieve different things. In and of itself, that doesn't have to be interpersonal conflict. That's just a part of the way that organizations are set up. Lastly, this is when we start talking about the bullying and harassment piece. You cannot better communicate or courageously conversate your way out of being a victim of bullying and harassment. If this is something that you're experiencing, these are not the tools to be using. If you have a bully or someone who is harassing someone, a client or a colleague at work, that needs to be escalated and to be dealt with different tools. So if that's a problem or something you're navigating, at the end of the session, you'll have a link to book in some time with me if you like to, just for a complimentary conversation. If you're not a client, or if you are a client, we can just have a chat. So if that's something you're navigating, these courageous conversation and these conflict management tools are not the best, because they're designed for situations where both people are trying to get a good outcome. And if there is bullying or harassment happening, that's indicated that that's not what we're dealing with. So what is it that drives conflict? Why is it so hard for humans to work together? Let me count the many ways that we can be in conflict with each other, even though we're trying to work towards the same things. So most of the time, or the single most common reason that I see where there is conflict is it comes down to communication styles. This might be because you have someone who's really task focused. They focus on getting the work done. They focus on outcomes. And once that's taken care of, maybe then they can ask you how your weekend is. But if you have someone who's more people focused. They start with the relationship. They want to make sure everyone feels good about kind of who's there and what's going on. And once they have that sense of confidence, then they can move to the work and the outcome. You can immediately see that you're going to be talking at cross purposes, not because either of those approaches, is better or worse than the other. They're just different. And so you're going to be looking for different things and talking about different things when you're dealing with those colleagues. Neurodivergence often can lead to different communication styles. So if we're thinking about people with autism spectrum disorder, the way that they communicate and interact can feel quite jarring for neurotypical people or for holistic people. Again, if you've got a diagnosis like ADHD, like me, that can mean we talk very, very fast, as some of you might be noticing, or it can be difficult for us to focus on one particular thing because our attention is so broadly spread. Again, nothing wrong with an ASD or an ADHD diagnosis, but the way that you show up at work is going to be different to the neurotypical people there, which can lead to conflict because you're showing up and communicating in different ways. Sometimes it's the working environment. If there are unclear expectations about what it is that you or your team are trying to achieve, or if you have overlapping responsibilities with someone else or a different person, it's going to be hard to figure out who should do what and who's responsible for what, and that's where there can be some conflict because you're both trying to kind of do the same thing, or you might end up treading on each other's toes. Sometimes you do have bad actors. So narcissists, if you've got people with antisocial personality disorder, which used to be called kind of sociopathy was the older language for that. These people are going to be very hard to work with at work because of the ways that they perceive and engage with and choose to prioritize or not in the relationships that they have with their colleagues and their clients. Now, we think that between about 2 and 5% of the adult population will have NPD, narcissistic personality disorder, or ASPD. So they're a very, very small proportion of people overall. What is much more common is bullying. So we know that between 20 and 35% of New Zealand workers will experience bullying in any given year. So between 1 in 5 of us or 1 in 3 of us. Bullying at work is really, really common. Again, if that's the situation you're dealing with, it can be hard to use these kind of communication-focused tools to navigate your way out of that work. If you do have bad actors, your choices then are around moving them on from the workplace, following a no dickheads rule or a no asshole rule, or if it's really critical for whatever reason to keep them in the business, it may be just about damage control and about limiting their impact and contact with other people so that they can do the work that they need to do. Interestingly, we know that CEOs and surgeons, to use 2 examples, tend to have higher rates of diagnosis for antisocial personality disorder because of the types of behaviour that those career paths reward. So we certainly don't want to have no surgeons, but we just might want to be thoughtful about the ways that we buffer perhaps their colleagues and the nursing staff, for example, from interacting with them to kind of keep that risk of conflict down. Needs and expectations come into play at the workplace too. It's not very common for us to cop to needs like having that something would go our way, whether it's a promotion or a particular project. It's not often that we will say at work, I don't feel recognised, or I don't feel safe, I don't feel uncomfortable. But if we have those needs and they're not being met, that can lead us to act out or to behave in ways that may cause conflict with other people that we're working with. Now, sometimes we're the problem, as the Taylor Swift lyric goes. So where we have ineffective boundaries, that can result in us showing up to work in ways that aren't helpful. For example, if you have stuff going on in your personal life, as every single person I have ever worked with does, if you don't have the resources or the tools or the support outside of work to manage whatever it is that's going on, your personal life can spill over into work. And so the anger that you're feeling at your co-parent for the way that they're treating your shared child can come out as anger at a colleague or a customer, for example. If you are a people pleaser who says yes to everything because you really want to help and you really want to get involved, potentially you could be under delivering because you're not managing your boundaries around your capacity and your workflow and what it is that you're taking on. This is not intended to blame people who are experiencing either of those things, but just to point out that sometimes it's our tools and what we're bringing to work that can be what's driving or certainly exacerbating the conflict. This applies to if we don't have very good self-management skills. So if we're the ones always losing our temper, if we're dealing with really big feelings inappropriately at work, again, that can result in us being the cause of the intense feelings or the conflict because we're not managing whatever is going on very well for us. So having talked about what drives conflict, let's spend a little bit of time thinking about what happens when we're experiencing conflict, because that makes the tools that we talk about make much more sense. So what's happening in our brains? And we're going to get sciencey for a second. I'm personally really interested in neuroscience and kind of human behavior. So I'm drawing on some of the tools and resources that I've come across, hopefully in a reasonably accessible way. But if this is not your gig, hopefully the animations will keep you entertained as we move through some of this content. So this is a picture of the human brain. What you're seeing on the left-hand side is the front of our brain, so where our forehead is, behind our forehead. What you're seeing on the right-hand side is what's at the back of our head, so sitting sort of towards the bottom of our skull. And the brain stem here is what comes up through the neck and connects into our brain, and it's the first part of our brain that evolved, or it's the oldest part of our brain, evolutionarily speaking. We share a brain stem with most other vertebrates, so mammals and lizards and fish, I think, as well. So it's the first part of our brain that evolved, and it deals with the most important things to our body being alive. So it's our physiological functioning, right? So it regulates our heart and our breathing. It's where our central nervous system is very connected. It controls our sleep cycle. So it's really important for our bodies to keep breathing in and out, and for all of our systems, our physiological systems, to be working. The next part of our brain to evolve was our limbic system. So this is where our emotions and our feelings and our social senses kind of live. This is where our fight or flight response kicks in. It's where our adrenaline comes from. It's the amygdala, which deals with emotions. So this is the part of the brain which manages emotional and social functioning. If there are risks, if we experience fear, this is the part of the brain that kicks in to keep us safe, right? Now, our cortex and our prefrontal cortex, so the top and the front part of our brains, evolved most recently, and this is where our conscious brain lives, right? It's the part of our brain that we think of as us. It's where we think of and make choices, and we plan and we decide things. So this is where our executive and intentional functioning lives. When you make a choice to make some falafel for dinner rather than getting KFC, that's the front part of your brain making a conscious choice. When you choose to study medicine instead of law, that's your brain making a conscious choice. You're evaluating different priorities and making different choices here. Now, you can see that some of these functions are going to be more important for our survival, and some of them are going to be less. So when we are experiencing stress, when we're feeling on the outs, when we're feeling excluded, if we're experiencing fight or flight, our brain will physically redirect blood flow and the glucose that our brain needs to function away from the intentional, deliberate part of our brain and the cortexes back to our limbic system, because that's the part of the brain that deals with, am I safe? Do I feel comfortable? Am I at risk of being outed from my social group? So when we're stressed or when we're feeling really heightened, we actually physically don't have the energy or the juice in our brains to make deliberate, intentional choices. If you've ever lost your temper and said something that you've regretted to a partner or a child or a colleague, if you've seen red during a sports game and just totally smashed the person on the other team that you're playing, if you've ever felt really, really sad and kind of gone and made food choices that you're not happy with, like eating a whole bucket of ice cream for dinner. I mean, I've been there. That's because the front part of your brain that makes deliberate choices is offline. You actually can't make good decisions when you're heightened or in a heightened emotional state. Your brain is redirecting your resources to keep you safe to the older parts of the brain that have been there for a much longer period of time. So mini neuroscience and obviously very spark notes neuroscience lecture over. We then talk about what it is that we can do when we're responding to conflict and we're feeling stressed. And the first thing I want to talk about is the red head versus blue head model that was developed in the early 2000s. So it would be interesting if you were in the room to do a quick hands up who's heard of red head, blue head. It became popularized because the All Blacks brought a couple of the consultants from Gazing Consultancy who came up with the model to work with them after they lost the quarterfinal to France in the Rugby World Cup in the 2007 World Cup. So the red head, blue head model talks about the importance of recognizing and responding to what is going on with our bodies or our systems when we're experiencing stress, when we're in a heightened state of emotion. So when you're in the red space on the left of the screen, when you're feeling red, It'll feel like you're stressed, you're overwhelmed, you're tense, or you're kind of het up, whatever that looks like to you. So that might mean that your heart is pounding, maybe you're breathing more quickly and more shallowly, you might be sweating if you're a sweater, you might have a physical sense of tightness or of urgency, you might be feeling angry or anxious. I'm a little bit in my blue head right now because doing a webinar is a somewhat stressful experience, so I know that my pulse is a bit faster, my breathing is a bit shallower than normal. So when you're in this red state, again, this is your body telling you that there is a risk or there is danger or something's not right. And so it's sending resources away from the sensible, controlled front part of your brain into your older parts of your brain to keep you safe. When you're in a blue state, though, when you've got your blue head on, it's the opposite. You feel very calm, you can take deep breaths, you'll be able to focus on what it is that you're choosing to focus on, rather than maybe having your attention repeatedly drawn to the stressful thing or to the conflict. You can probably feel reasonably relaxed, your breathing is steady, and your body will feel looser and calmer than it is when you're in a red state. So just as we're working through this, I would encourage you to reflect on a time, maybe in the last week or two, when you felt very blue, you felt very calm, you felt very focused. Perhaps you were able to deal with a curveball or something that went a bit sideways without too much distress. And also in the last week or two, think about a time when you had your red head on, when you were overwhelmed or hyped up or stressed, or your heart was pounding, or your breaths were coming a bit faster and a bit shallower. Think about those examples and think about physically what it felt like as a way to reflect on what the signals are that you might be in a red head state versus the signals that you might be in a blue head state. You're welcome to share them if you like to, but I won't ask you to do that because that can get a bit sensitive. So once you've recognized your state of mind, we can then choose to respond to whatever's in front of us. And in the context of responding to conflict, it's really critical that the first thing we do is to go from red to blue. If we're in a really het up red head state, we're not going to be able to respond rationally or fairly or reasonably to the situation that's in front of us. So whatever the tools are that you use to go from red to blue, make use of them now when you're feeling stressed or when you're in conflict with someone. So that might be sleeping on it, honestly. That might be going for a walk. It could be going to a karate class. It might be going to yoga to kind of slow your body down. It could be calling up your best mate and just having a real good old complain about whatever's going on, so then you feel calmer. Journaling, swimming, exercise, whatever the tools are that you use to calm down, you need to use those tools to get into a blue state, and at which point you can then decide how to respond. So assuming we are now in a blue state, well done everyone, love the work that you're doing. Let's talk about what our choices are when we respond to conflict, and then we'll do a deep dive into courageous conversations again, which is the tool we're going to be spending a bit of time on today. Sometimes it will be appropriate for you to just let something go. And letting it go doesn't mean making a mental note in your little black book of grievances and then coming back to it 6 weeks later when something blows up. Letting it go truly means that you've recognized it's not something important and you've decided to park it for the moment. An example I had from earlier this month was a colleague of mine who I get on really well with. We've got a really good working relationship. In a meeting where we were trying to decide the next steps for a particular project, she was quite short with me. She kept cutting me off. The suggestions I was tabling, she kind of kept shutting down. And so I was not that happy with that experience in that meeting. But I know, because we have a good relationship, that she's been dealing with quite a lot of difficulties outside of work. And she's pretty under-resourced at the moment in terms of dealing with conflict at work. So knowing that we broadly have a good relationship, knowing that that's not how she normally behaves, and knowing that there are outside factors that she's just trying to stay on top of at the moment, I just let it go. I didn't send her a message. I haven't put it down as a black mark against her. I just written it off as an experience that wasn't ideal, but I know that the next time we come together, and we have done since, will be positive. She'll be able to listen to my feedback and my suggestions, and everything will go well. So letting it go just means going. It's fine. I'm not gonna stress about it. Whatever's going on, I'm gonna choose to park. Letting it go is very different to doing nothing. So doing nothing is choosing to do nothing for now, but making a note of what's ever happened and revisiting it later if you need to see if there's a pattern. It's sometimes called masterly inactivity, which, believe it or not, is a term that first came up in German military kind of theory and practice from the 18th century. So never say that HR doesn't draw on a very wide range of sources, but masterly inactivity is doing nothing for now, whether that's because you know that you've got too much of a red head on to react rationally, whether you haven't seen this behavior from your boss before and you're not sure if it's a one-off and you can let it go, or if it's an ongoing thing you might need to deal with. Doing nothing is just parking it for now, but being aware that it's happened and revisiting it if you need to. The third thing that you might need to do, and again, these are not in hierarchical order, so you might choose all of these or none of these. It's not like it's a 1 to 7 list in order, is to gather some more information. So where you have, for example, a colleague who maybe has repeatedly snapped at you in meetings and repeatedly won't let you finish what it is that you have to say, you might want to get a bit more information. So maybe you go out with them for a coffee and say, hey, like kind of what's going on? I noticed that you've been pretty short at work lately. Or if you're hearing reports from a particular member of your team that their colleague is constantly nagging at them and being shitty and just kind of being a bit of a dickhead to work with, you might just have a couple of conversations to see if that's behavior anyone else has witnessed and just get a handle on what's going on. So you acknowledge that you don't have enough to do something right now, or don't have enough information to do something right now, but you're going to get more information so that you can decide how to proceed. And if it's a pattern of behavior, maybe you move to giving someone feedback, or if it was a severe enough kind of once-off issue. Now, giving feedback should happen, ideally, just in the flow of day-to-day business. There's nothing wrong with saying to your colleague, hey, I know that you've asked me a couple of times to give you input into this particular document we're sending out to clients. I've noticed that you keep giving me 1 or 2 hours notice for my input, and if you ask for my feedback by 5 p.m. at 3 p.m. That makes it really hard for me to go through it with enough detail and enough time to give you feedback, because I'm often busy in the afternoons dealing with the receipts that are piling up. So next time, would you mind giving it to me in the morning, or say by 12 or 1 p.m, and then I've got a long enough window to make sure I can review the document and I can give you the feedback that you're looking for. That should be a pretty low tension, low friction experience. You're just asking for something to be a bit different so that you can work towards the outcome that this person wants, which is giving them feedback. Sorry, getting feedback from you on the document. Again, if it's a relational thing, you might say to someone, hey, I'm a bit uncomfortable with the way that you have spoken over me in meetings recently. It's important to me that I can finish my thought. I know that I can take a bit of, I'm not as quick as you as forming my opinions. I need a bit more time to process. Do you think in the next meetings we have about this project, you could just take a bit of a second to let me finish before you jump in with your ideas? That would make me feel like I can have my say, and then we can kind of move things forward. The next step up, in my view, from just giving someone feedback as part of the ebb and flow of working life, is to have an informal discussion with them. This might be taking a colleague out for coffee. This might be saying to your boss, hey, can we have a quick chat? There's a couple of things that I want to raise with you. Or it might be having that conversation with one of your direct reports if it's someone in your team. And an informal discussion is more formal than feedback in that you are setting aside time. You're ideally going into a separate space, whether it's a cafe or a meeting room, or waiting till the office is clear, to say, I've observed these behaviors, or I've observed this issue happening. I'm not happy with how this is going because I have concerns that it could lead to unhappy customers, or it's not how we act at ABC Limited, or I'm concerned that it's going to kind of cause friction in the team. So I'm giving you some feedback that I've got concerns here. What can we do to fix it? Do you need any help from me? Do you need some guidance? Does your schedule need to be different? How can we rearrange your workflow? Whatever it is, let's talk about it. But I'm kind of giving you a heads up that this is maybe not going so well, and I would like for us to be focusing on the next steps. In the context of interpersonal conflict, this tends to be a bit of a, hey, I've noticed something is off in our relationship because your behavior is different, or I find myself getting stressed before our meetings, which is not pleasant, and I'm kind of a bit of a loss of what to do. Has something changed? Is there anything I need to be aware of? Either you have tried versions of this and now you're moving to a courageous conversation, or the situation is severe or intense or uncomfortable enough that you don't think kind of giving feedback informally or having a bit of a loose discussion is going to cut it. Of course, you can jump straight to a courageous conversation if that's appropriate for your context, but often there will be other things that we can have tried along the way to get there. So we'll talk about courageous conversations in depth in a minute. But sometimes what you will need to do is exit the situation. And by exit the situation, I don't mean resign, and I don't mean throw your toys and refuse to come to work when that person's in the office. What I mean is sometimes there are people that we just have to work with who we cannot have a civil relationship with. And sometimes you just need to go, okay, I'm actually going to write Sylvie off as someone that I am pleasant to at work because for whatever reason our dynamic is so uncomfortable or is so toxic. So I'm going to behave professionally. I will respond to Sylvie's emails on time. I will make sure that she has the information from my team that she needs to get there. But actually, I'm not going to pursue a relationship with her. And anything that she does, which might be snarky or mean, I'm just going to let it go because I've just kind of exited that relationship. I'm not going to deal with her anymore. I'm going to be professional, but I'm actually just setting a personal boundary and managing my energy around the type of relationship I want to have with her. That's easier said than done. It's a skill that can take some time to build, and often there are things which will make that boundary quite hard to manage. But if for whatever reason it's not possible for you to try and improve the relationship, if for whatever reason you can't raise the conflict with them, sometimes you do just have to hunker down and kind of harden your shell to that person to protect your own peace and your own energy from dealing with them. Not something I would recommend jumping to immediately, but certainly if it's not a choice for you to resign, or if there are other changes you can't make, or if otherwise you're really happy in your job and don't want to leave, you might just need to kind of deaden yourself to that person to move forward. So let's move to talking about courageous conversations, and then that will bring us to resources and questions. So a courageous conversation is any conversation where you're being vulnerable and you can't control the outcome. And we have courageous conversations all the time in our personal lives, perhaps without realizing it. So this might be with a spouse saying, hey, I really don't want to go away with your family for 2 weeks because I find your brother really awkward to deal with. It's just uncomfortable. Maybe it's with a friend about how you felt let down that they prioritized a different birthday party over your graduation, whatever the issue is. It could be with a parent around the fact that they keep coming over unannounced and you're saying, hey, it makes me feel really uncomfortable when you keep coming into my space without an invitation. So any of those types of conversations, I think we're familiar with as thinking about feeling vulnerable. But in this context, of course, we're focusing on courageous conversations at work. So this might be a time when you're having to say to a boss, I'm uncomfortable with the way that you're giving me feedback in public. It makes me really embarrassed, or it makes me feel really put on the spot when you give me that feedback in front of the team. I want to improve and to learn, but can we please make sure that that happens privately so that I feel safe enough to take it on and I don't immediately get defensive. Sometimes it's with a colleague to say, hey, I know that you like to talk about your weekend and there's lots going on in your life. I find it really distracting when I come in on a Monday and or Wednesday morning and I'm immediately bombarded with kind of an update from you on your life. Would it be okay if we set aside time maybe once a week for us to catch up? Because I really value our relationship, but I just can't cope with the constant kind of flood of information. You wouldn't call it drama, but kind of about what's going on in your life. So take a second now to think of a time when you avoided having a courageous conversation. Was there a difficult relationship with a colleague that you avoided addressing? Potentially, was there a boss where there was some tension that needed to be released or addressed there? Was there a customer who kept behaving in ways that were inappropriate? I'll give us 5 or 10 seconds just because I'm mindful of time, but have a think about a time when you avoided having a courageous conversation. Just for yourself, think about what got in your way, what were the dynamics you were managing, was there anything that you were afraid of happening if you didn't have the conversation, and just for a minute sit with that and reflect on that experience. So having that example in your mind, I'm hopeful that working through the courageous conversation framework shortly is going to give you some tools that the next time you know that there is a conversation you need to have, you'll feel much more equipped to do that. So let's start running through. So courageous conversations, as I mentioned earlier, there are many frameworks that use the language courageous conversations. The work that I do here draws quite heavily on Brené Brown's work, and I've got a book of hers that I'm recommending towards the end. But basically, it's any conversation where you need to have something or need to say something that's going to be a bit uncomfortable. And I'm hopeful that any of these individual sets of activities and questions will be useful to you, even if you don't deploy the whole model. It's quite a useful one to go through. So when you're addressing something that's going on, spend a bit of time doing some prep. And the questions you might want to ask yourself, and this could be written down on a whiteboard, even just as you're driving home, might be, what's the situation as I understand it? What do I believe is happening here, and why is that frustrating or upsetting or hurtful to me? And what do I want to happen as a result of this discussion, or what actions do I want? What's the purpose in bringing this up? What am I looking for? And that just might be to feel heard. Sometimes, excuse me, it can feel like we're being petty to say, I just want an apology for the way that you dealt with this. But that might be all you want. You don't need some big kind of kumbaya, come to Jesus sort of moment. You just might want to have your side of the story heard and to then have an apology or have that acknowledged by the other party, and that's perfectly legit. Then spend a bit of time thinking about what information might you be missing. There are at least two sides to every story, and potentially there's a piece here that you're not aware of, which could be driving the conflict or could be making that person behave in a way that's making you feel uncomfortable. So you need to be pretty well resourced to do this, because you'll notice that we're using the front part of our brain here, right? We're reflecting on the situation, we're thinking about the future in terms of what we want to happen or what we want to be different, and we're engaging in a bit of creative thinking here about what information might we be missing, and a bit of empathy to start thinking about what might be happening that we're not aware of. So make sure you've got really good sleep, make sure that you're well hydrated and you've got good food. So that's protein, fats, carbohydrates, make sure you've got a good balance there. Do some practice and some prep for the conversation if you need to. And one of the resources I'll be sharing later is a worksheet for you to use and go through. Make sure you have privacy to do your prep, as well as privacy to have the conversation with this person. And if you find them useful, you might choose to use some mindfulness tools kind of as you build up to this, whether that's journaling or meditating. I think yoga I mentioned earlier. If those tools are useful to you, you may find it helpful to engage in them now, so that as you come to the conversation, you're feeling pretty calm and pretty level, and you're clear on what it is that you're asking for, that you're looking for from this discussion. So during the conversation, we open with setting the scene, introduce everyone if required. At work, sometimes we can have mediated conversations, or if it's two members of our team who are clashing and not getting along, sometimes we're the mediator because we're the one-up, and so we're managing this. Introduce everyone and explain what you'd like to achieve today as a starting point. So that might be language like, the purpose of this conversation is to resolve your frustrations about how a particular project went. And I will feel like today has been successful if the two of you as my direct reports both feel like you've got a bit of empathy and a bit of care from the other person, and that you can move forward in dealing with this conflict, or that it doesn't kind of come up again. I'll feel like that's been successful. And then it's time for the other person to have their piece. So what would success look like for you today? What are you hoping to get out of this conversation? Of course, if you're working with someone who doesn't have this model in their head, they might just say, well, I don't know, because you're the one who's called the meeting. So I'm just kind of here to hear what you have to say. And that's fine. They can just say, well, I just want to know what you have to say. And if I understand that it'll be successful, that's perfectly fine. During the discussion, you need to start by saying your piece, and as much as you can, use I statements. So I've observed that you keep cutting me off in meetings, or I was uncomfortable with the way that this client meeting was handled because you kept undermining my advice in front of the CEO of this large customer that we work with. We don't want to say you were being a dickhead or you never trust me to get things right with customers, because we're putting beliefs or behavior onto the other person that might not be true. All we can speak to is our experience, which is why we talk about using I statements. Sometimes we need to apologize. And if apologizing isn't a vulnerable conversation, I don't know what is. It can be really hard to say, I feel like I was out of order and I want to apologize for the way I handled XYZ. And then we name the outcome that we want to achieve. I would like for us to have a warm working relationship, or I would like an apology, or I would just like for you to acknowledge what my experience was as we went through that process or that experience together. And explain why it's important. Obviously, if it's someone you work with closely, having a warm working relationship will make life much more comfortable and much easier for everyone. Now, during this session, as you're discussing this, make sure that you are collaborating, because both parties have to be participating in order for this to be a meaningful experience and to move things forward. So understand the situation from their perspective, and are there differences? So some questions you might want to ask are, is there anything I've missed? Is there anything you think I don't understand? Really spend some time getting to grips with the story that they have in their head, because again, if you're working at cross purposes or not talking and not connecting with each other, a lot of that gap between where you're at and what you're thinking and where they're at and what they're thinking, that shows up as those conflict behaviors. So you really have to spend a fair bit of time diving into what's been going on for them. You don't have to agree with them, but you do have to understand. We're asking questions to make sure we understand their perspective, not necessarily to agree with their perspective, because you may not. So language that is quite useful can be things like, let me play that back to you. What I'm hearing is that X, Y, Z. Or have I got it right if I say you were feeling really under pressure because of the sales targets put on you by the sales manager, and so when it felt to you like I was waffling or taking a long time in that meeting with the customer, you really wanted me to kind of speed it up and to show the same sense of urgency. Have I got it? Does that sound like what was happening for you? Once you've got a good understanding of where both parties are at, we then move to the next steps in wrapping up the conversation. So agree on the outcome that you want to achieve. If it's something you both want, you can use language like, it sounds like we both want for us to have a good working relationship. Or it sounds like we both want for there to be more urgency in the business when it comes to dealing with high profile customers. Sometimes you won't want the same things, and that's okay. So you'll say, is it fair to say that you want for me to show some urgency when dealing with customers, and I want to be given enough time to talk my thoughts out and to say my piece when I'm having these conversations. And discuss what you can both do to work towards that outcome or those outcomes, because often they won't be in conflict. So some language you might find useful are, I think some things that I can contribute are making sure that I do enough prep for those meetings so that I've done my thinking beforehand, and as much as I'm able to, I can be concise and I can be precise in those meetings. So I'll commit to doing more work beforehand, so I'm not thinking out the answer as I'm in the conversation, which it sounds like you'd find it frustrating. What I think you can take accountability for is, when we're in these meetings, being mindful of what it looks like to the customer when you keep cutting me off and making other comments. So I think you can be accountable for slowing down a little bit and giving me space to get to my point. And if you slow down and if I do more prep, I think we'll get to a point where those meetings with customers feel like they're going much more smoothly. Does that agree? Do you agree? So agree on and then confirm the plan. So you will work to be calm in those meetings, and I will do prep beforehand to be ready for them. Is that correct? And then how will you decide if this has been successful? Do you need to meet again to review what's been happening? Is it worth catching up in 8 weeks to make sure that things go smoothly? Or are you going to be more relaxed about it and just kind of be ad hoc? And if and when it becomes a problem again, maybe you'll check in. After the session, for goodness sake, disengage and give yourself some time to come down. When we're using the front part of our brain, so our careful, logical, thoughtful, kind of empathizing, imaginative parts of our brain, that uses up a lot of energy. It can be very, very tiring to do this work. So give yourself space to come down, whether that looks like going for a walk, having a cup of tea, journaling, whatever the tools are that you need to disengage, make use of them at that point in time. And then share your agreed actions or plan in writing if you need to. So this could be over email, this could be printed, kind of whatever makes sense. Maybe it's a Slack message or a Teams message if you use those platforms. Whatever you need to do to kind of capture just a short record of what's been agreed, so you can both refer back to it later on if you need to. The most important thing now is for you to do the things that you have agreed to do. If you have agreed that you will do that prep before meetings with customers to make sure that you are prepped and ready so that you're not kind of fumbling your way through your responses, you need to do that, because if you don't, one, you're not going to get the outcome you're looking for, and two, you will have lost credibility and trust with that particular person that you will do what you say that you will do to make working life kind of easier and less distressing. So it's really critical that you do those things. If you don't follow through on them, you may as well not have had the conversation. So when you're doing your prep and when you're doing your planning around maybe how to raise these topics with the person you're in conflict with, or with the people who are in conflict, make sure you're mentally allocating enough time and energy and kind of headspace to deal with the follow-ups, because it's not a one and done. It's the start of a process. It's going to involve some follow-up and execution, and also making sure that you loop back around to check in with things if need to. Again, you won't need this in all situations, but you may find it helpful. So that brings us to the end of that more detailed section, and we'll talk a little bit here about some bonus resources if this is useful to you. So in the next couple of days, you'll get a follow-up email kind of wrapping up from this webinar. There'll be the recording as well as the slides for you to refer to later if you find it helpful. There will also be a 3 or 4 page document which has all of that language that I talked through and that you can use to help yourself prep for courageous conversations as and when you need. So there'll be a PDF for you there. There'll also be a link to book in 20-minute consultation sections with me if anything in this session has prompted some thoughts for you. If you're an existing customer, that's great. We've probably crossed paths before. Just book in some time. If you're not a client of ours at the moment. No stress, it's complimentary. You won't get a hard sell from me. We can just have a conversation about whatever's going on in your business or in your team and perhaps put a bit of a plan together for you. That link will be in the email, so if you're not copying it off the screen now, that's fine, you'll get it in the follow-up as well. Now, this is work I'm quite passionate about, and I found really useful in my kind of experience and work as a people leader and as an HR professional and as a coach. So some resources I wanted to share here were a couple of books. So the first one's called Burnout by Emily Nagoski and Amelia Nagoski. They are a psychiatrist, she's a counselor and clinical psychologist, I think, and her sister is a high-profile kind of musician and violinist, and it's a really, really good resource for managing your own stress response and managing your own health and well-being so that you're resourced to turn up to these sessions. It's written with women in mind, but non-binary folk and men, I think, will find it useful as well, because we all have versions of the same physiology, and so there are some really useful tools in there. The chimp paradox, again, is a really good one for being aware of how you react to some of these situations and building in tools and systems to manage and stay on top of your reactions to things. Daring Greatly is one of Brené Brown's many books. It's where a lot of this work around courage and vulnerability comes from. If you're interested, she's got a TED Talk as well. Surrounded by Idiots is one of my favorite book titles ever, and that's a model for thinking about working styles. So it's based on the Carl Jung work around people-oriented, task-oriented, and tell assertive versus ask assertive. So if you're interested in how people's communication styles come out at work, that's a really good one. And the last one here is How to Deal with Difficult People by Gill, who is a New Zealand author, I believe. And if you do just have people in your life who are difficult or pains in the ass for whatever reason, there are some really good tools in there for dealing with aggressive, passive-aggressive, and passive people that are quite practical and quite hands-on. So that brings us to questions. We are slightly over time. I'm sorry, those technical issues in the beginning led me to delay, but I'll jump out of the screen sharing and just see if there are any questions or if there's anything that you would like to talk about today. I'm also happy to stick around for 10 minutes afterwards because I know that there were some questions coming through in that conversation. So let me jump back into the Zoom piece so you can see my face in its entirety as we work through questions. Let me just jump down to the bottom here. Cool. Just jumping back up to start the questions. Tony has said, Iceberg ahead, all good. Kia ora, Tony. I appreciate that enthusiasm, making sure my screen share was working. Thanks, team. Julie says, a biggie for me is working with passive-aggressive co-workers, which prevents effective team communication and results. And also how to deal with a colleague who's the same level as myself, but has begun delegating to me and telling me what I can and can't do. Makes me tense when we are on shift together. Thanks, Julie. I really appreciate you sharing that example. It sounds like that's feeling really uncomfortable for you at the moment. We'll start with the co-worker, it may be worth having a conversation with them to say, hey, can we have a chat about our working dynamic? There's some stuff that's coming up lately that I'm not super comfortable with. And maybe you just use that same language. I've noticed that your behavior has changed in the last 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks. And what I've observed is that you are giving me instructions that don't feel appropriate for my level of seniority, and here are some examples. And I've also noticed I'm getting a lot of work delegated my way from you that sort of feels like it would sit with you. That sort of doesn't feel appropriate given that we're colleagues on the same level. Is there anything going on with you that I'm not aware of? Has something changed? Do you have some expectations I'm not aware of? Can we have a conversation about this? Because I want us to work effectively together, but at the moment this behavior is making me a bit uncomfortable, and take it from there. That's obviously easier said than done. That Courageous Conversations workbook might be a useful piece for you. However, if you don't feel like you can address that with them for whatever reason, or maybe if you've tried to have versions of that conversation before and it hasn't worked, I would maybe escalate that to the person that you both report to, or to your manager if you have different managers, to just say, hey, I'd like to have a conversation about so-and-so's behavior. What I'm observing is that I'm receiving instructions and direction that don't feel appropriate because we're on the same level. And also there's been a bunch of work delegated to me that feels like it should sit with her. I'm sure there's stuff that I'm not aware of, but can we have a conversation about this? Because at the moment that relationship is feeling uncomfortable. And then you've done your job. You've identified what the problem is. You've included some examples. You've either raised it with them or you've raised it with your manager, and then it's kind of up to them as to how they want to deal with it and how they want to respond. So take a look at that workbook that comes through afterwards, and I hope that that's a useful piece there. Passive aggressive co-workers is a tricky one. That book, How to Deal with Difficult People by Gil Hassan, has a lot more examples about this. You sort of just need to be really clear and really unemotive. So when you get a comment like, oh, like, you know, typical of so-and-so, when, you know, a project changes or something's different, you might just want to say, oh, what do you mean by that? What do you mean typical? And then they'll kind of bluster and be a bit awkward, and you say, oh, that sounds like you're not really happy with the fact that this meeting keeps getting pushed out or this project keeps changing. Have you given so-and-so that feedback? And they'll say no, because they won't have done. And you go, okay, sounds like you're pretty frustrated, like have a think about raising that feedback to them. You kind of just have to keep pushing them in the direction of what the appropriate behavior is, and not getting sucked into the turmoil of the frustration that is often there. So sometimes they'll reach out and say, oh, wasn't it annoying how XYZ happened? And you can say, oh, like I thought it was pretty reasonable given the circumstances, like our sales are down, and so the fact that they're changing how our POS works kind of makes sense. You just have to not react to the emotional content of it, and also kind of probe and be calm and professional, and then redirecting their frustrations into the appropriate channel. They will pretty quickly learn that you're not going to stand for that type of behavior. And so either they will stop trying to lob like emotional bombs into your side of the net for you to respond to, or they just will kind of disengage and just treat you as a bit of a colleague because they know that you're not going to behave like that. Again, easier said than done, but have a think about how you might manage some of those boundaries and just draw your emotive content out of that relationship. Anonymous asks, how do you continue to work with someone when the trust has been totally diminished based on their behaviours and actions? That's a great question, and I'm sorry if that's happened to you. It can be a really distressing situation, especially when it's someone maybe that you were close with, or someone who's quite important to you at work, like a boss or a colleague that you work closely with. Either you can exit the situation, and by that I mean like resign ultimately if that relationship's not working for you. The other thing you can do is you can just, for your own values and for how you personally choose to show up to work, just decide that you're going to be cool and professional and not engage with them. So whether you do or don't trust them, you know, depending on what has happened in the past, you just might never seek them out as social companions. You might not ever kind of sit next to them at morning teas. You might never hang out with them at the Christmas party. You just might keep your relationship with them totally task focused and totally about the work that you have to do together. And maybe that's enough to kind of manage your peace, and for you to know that you're showing up as a grown-up and showing up as an adult in that relationship, but you won't ever trust them with confidential information, or you won't ever trust them with anything personal that might be happening. Depending on who they are to you at work, that can be a bit difficult to manage, but see if there is a way that you can make peace with the fact that you're showing up as a grown-up, just to kind of focus on the work and do nothing else. And if that helps you, just kind of mentally write them off as someone you're not going to spend any more time or energy on. Cool. Haley says, do you have any advice or a framework you can use to help facilitate a conversation between two people to resolve their conflict? Hi, Haley. Thank you for coming along. I would have a look at that courageous conversations piece at the end that's going to come through in the follow-up materials. If you have authority over them, as in they are two employees who are in conflict together, you may be able to say, guys, I'm just going to call it. This niggly thing, whatever is going on, is not cool, and we're not going to behave like that at work. I'm going to facilitate a session with us to kind of address the issue. Are you both comfortable with that? Would you like a support person to come along? And here's the workbook we're both going to work through. Sylvie, I would like for you to go through this, and Jocelyn, I would like for you to go through this as well. We'll come together, we'll talk it out, and we'll agree on a plan. But it is not acceptable any longer for this niggly or this toxicity to continue, and we're going to do something about it. Before you get to that point, you might want to say to them both, this is not acceptable. Would you like to try and resolve this on your own? Or would you like me to step in and get involved so that you get their buy-in rather than you just, you know, barging into the relationship? But you can certainly use the workbook with them individually to work through it to resolve what's going on. Anonymous says, what you said about exiting the situation and keeping only a professional relationship with the conflicting coworker really struck a chord with me, and I can see how I can use this to protect myself. But how should I react when this colleague then becomes friendly at work? We are constantly swinging between screaming at each other and sharing jokes, and this is frustrating for me because I would like to be on good terms with her, but I also can't handle the constant conflict. I'm glad that struck a chord. Thank you for sharing. It's great to hear that this is useful to you and is things that might be useful for you in this relationship. I think you have two choices. I think choice one is to say to have a courageous conversation with this person and to say, this dynamic isn't it. Like, this is not cute. I'm not about the swings in temperature in this relationship. Sometimes we're joking, sometimes we're shouting at each other. I'm not going to engage in that any longer. I would love to work with you to see, what we might be able to do as a pair, as a couple, to make sure that this isn't the dynamic and this isn't how it goes. Are you kind of up for that? Would you want to have that conversation? And if they say yes, cool, you can run through that with them and do the exercise and see where you get to. And maybe that will mean you get to a point where the shouting aspect is at least minimized and the being on good terms piece increases. That would be great. However, you might not trust that that's going to be the case, or you might not have the energy to deal with it, or you might just be over it for whatever reason because of how long this dynamic has gone on. At which point, if you do want to just exit the relationship and kind of disengage, withdrawing from the negative stuff also means withdrawing from the positive stuff. And that sounds really harsh, but I say that because if you just don't engage with the screaming and the shouting, but then you react really positively to the friendly stuff, I think it will be quite hard for you, and has been hard for me, if I'm being honest, managing some of these relationships in my time. It'll be hard for you to not engage in the hope that this relationship will always be positive. And then when it becomes negative again, you're going to have the disappointment and the frustration and the anger and the hurt, which kind of isn't actually solving the problem. So I would think having the conversation with them about the issue, or just going, I'm actually just going to call it. This has kind of been enough for now. Like, I'm going to disengage. You are too volatile a person for me to trust kind of having in my inner circle. So I'm not going to be rude to you. Like, I'm not going to shout and scream, but also when you kind of come to me and play nice and want to make up, I'm actually not going to engage with that either, because I just don't trust that there's going to be any consistency here. So have a think about how that feels. If that sounds harsh, then maybe you don't want to go with that option. But I would either try the proactive above the line, let's try and have a conversation and improve this relationship, or I think you mentally just need to kind of put a line through them as someone that you trust and are comfortable with at work, and disengage from the volatility as well as from the positive stuff. Shirley says, this webinar is by far the best I've attended, very informative and useful. Stop it, Shirley. You can come back anytime. Thank you for sharing that feedback. That's lovely to hear. Madison says, great session. Thank you, Manny. Anonymous asks, how do you recommend approaching your manager, who is one of 2 company directors, who shows signs of narcissistic personality disorder and is often at the center of most interpersonal employee conflict and toxicity? The other is the opposite, but often lacks the confidence to address those behaviors. I would weigh up how much energy I was willing to put into trying to improve that relationship or that behavior. And if you are willing to put some effort into it, I think the courageous conversation template particularly is helpful. We can kind of only speak in using these sorts of tools to our experience. So if you're seeing shit happen with this intense director and other employees, it's kind of not your business to manage unless it starts to affect you. But if they're dealing with some stuff over there, I kind of would leave it alone, or like share the webinar with these employees so that they can raise it with them. But unless you're a manager with a team under you, or maybe a member of the union, you don't really have the authority to kind of step in and represent other people. So keep to speaking to your own experiences. And if you are having experiences with this director that are uncomfortable and not constructive and all of the bad things we've talked about, certainly have that courageous conversation piece with them if you want to try and have the discussion. Potentially with the other director, you also might want to give them a heads up before you talk to the difficult director to say, hey, I'm no longer going to tolerate this kind of behavior. I'm giving you a heads up that I'm going to have a conversation with this person about it, and that might go badly. So I wanted you to be aware. I don't need you to do anything. I'm going to go and manage the conversation, but just a heads up that this kind of might blow up. My expectation is that that won't result in meaningful change for you, because I am a cynic and have seen many of these situations go kind of nowhere for a long time. So if you do have the energy to pursue some change there, that's great. You'll have my full support to give it a go. Alternatively, you might just want to exit from that dynamic or exit from that relationship and just go, they've got their own stuff going on for whatever reason. I have enough resources to do my job. I feel safe enough and happy enough here to kind of continue. I'm not going to pursue change. I'm just going to choose not to care or engage in that dynamic or that relationship anymore, and just kind of move on that way. The third option, of course, is to leave if that dynamic is so destructive or so all-encompassing that it is kind of affects everyone with the whirlpool and the kind of the wind around what's going on. But that's sort of up to you. So you have some choices there. Yeah, just weigh up what energy you want to be spending on this and how long you want to pursue it for. Roel asks, kia ora, Roel, thank you for joining us. Would you also consider cultural background as a factor in a lot of workplace conflict? That's a really excellent question. It definitely is a factor, particularly in cultures where there are different power distances. So power distance is kind of as part of a cultural model for thinking about how different cultures are comfortable or not with authority, basically. So in New Zealand, we have very low power distance. We will often call our bosses by their first name, like I call my boss Sean, I don't call him Mr. O'Brien. We typically have flatter structures. Typically, it would be fine for me to go to marketing and go, hey, can I have a conversation about this project? I don't have to go to my boss to then talk to marketing, to then talk to their person to kind of come back up. So in New Zealand, we have a very low power distance kind of culture. From countries like South Korea, Japan, certainly parts of India, they have a much higher power distance culture. It would be very inappropriate for them to call their boss by their first name. If they wanted to talk to someone in another department, they have to go through official channels. So that immediately you can see where there's room for conflict, right? Because someone from South Korea might feel I was being overly familiar with them by talking to them about a project they're working on when they're not in my department. And I might feel like someone from South Korea was being quite cold and standoffish and like weirdly hierarchical by talking to my boss about something they should have talked to me about. So in that sense, it can be a background for conflict. It's not the main one though. In my experience, it tends to come down to communication styles and the ways that we work and people just not being very good at communicating, which can be influenced by cultural background, but it's not the one I see the most of, I think. It also tends to be a bit easier to, justifies the wrong word, but if I have someone who is like a born and raised Kiwi, regardless of their ethnic background, who's been to the same sorts of schools and the same sorts of universities as me, if they're behaving in a way that makes me feel uncomfortable, I tend to think of that as a them problem, which means it's an interpersonal problem to solve in my mind. Whereas if I'm working with someone who is maybe of a different generation, has come from a different working environment overseas, and appears to be someone who has had very different working experience, it's easier for me to go, oh, that's just how South Koreans kind of expect to communicate. No dramas, it's not a them problem or a me problem, we just have different expectations. So in some ways, when there's a visible or a tangible cultural difference, it's easier to hang the tension of the issue on that. So it's not me versus you, it's me and you versus the way that Kiwis communicate versus people from South Korea communicate, for example. So yes, it's a factor. It depends on the situation. Sometimes it makes it easier because then you know the person's not being a dickhead. They just come from a different background. But it certainly does show up and can exacerbate things sometimes. I think that was a long answer, but I hope that was useful. Laura asks, I'm worried about my boss reacting with passive aggressiveness. He can be moody and dismissive. I would like to talk about this, but I'm worried it will cause the same result and more bias about who I am from his side. That's a totally fair concern, Laura, especially when there's that power dynamic, when you're raising something with your boss. You have the choice to raise this issue with them or not. And if you do choose to, do it in the knowledge that you are doing this because it aligns with your values and how you like to show up at work and how you like to interact, and that if he responds by being dismissive or thinking that you're a weepy woman who kind of can't man up, I don't know what the dynamic is, that's a him problem. It's not a you problem. You've tried to address the issue, you've been fair and reasonable, you've done the prep work, you're not being unreasonable by asking for things to be different. And if he reacts badly to that, that's a him problem, it's not a you problem. Alternatively, you might just want to disengage and exit that relationship and go, I'm actually not going to let what this person thinks of me or how they behave ruin my day. I know that that's a them problem. It's got stuff to do with them. It's not to do with how I show up. It's not to do with my performance. It's not to do with who I am as a person. So I'm just going to stop caring, and actually it's going to be kind of water off a duck's back for now. So if you do choose to engage, you have my full support. Kind of do your prep and be ready for it. If you choose not to, no one's going to blame you. It sounds like a reasonable choice not to engage if you accept the result to be different. I am always really blown away by how positively people can react when it's clear that something's quite important to the person who's raising it with them. I've had to have a couple of courageous conversations where I took the worksheet I've sent around and I've written my notes and I've prepped and brought it to my bosses over the years. And that was really uncomfortable, of course, because there were things that we needed to work on in the way that we work together. But I've always been really impressed at how people respond. And so I'm always hopeful of a good outcome. But if you were to choose not to do it, kind of who could blame you, right? Like if they haven't earned your trust that they're a safe person to do this work with, you might choose not to engage them, and that's perfectly valid too. Anonymous asks, wondering if you have any tips to combat going into flight or fight in the face of aggressive team members in meetings. Oh, that's a great one. It sounds like this is your fight or flight that you're managing when you're kind of experiencing aggression. The first thing to do is amazing that you can acknowledge that. So well done for being aware of your own reactions. The first thing to do potentially would be to have some tools that you can use in the moment to come out of that headspace, whether that's a stress ball that you're squeezing, whether it's some deep breathing techniques that you can use. Box breathing is one if you want to Google that and have a look. Any of those kind of techniques you can use in the moment might be helpful to kind of bring you out of that headspace. The other thing to do potentially is if there's someone above you who you can talk to, who can jump in and cut the behavior out, you might want to try that as well. So going to your boss and saying, hey, Sylvie, I'm really uncomfortable and feel really distressed when Jason in meetings talks to me like this. I go into fight or flight. It's really hard for me to respond in the moment to their points. Can you have a word to them about this? Because I'm kind of not comfortable raising it directly. You could also say to that person, hey, we need to have a chat about the dynamic in meetings because I don't think you're behaving appropriately and I would like some change. You manage that within that kind of courageous conversation framework as well. So potentially some techniques for yourself in the moment to kind of come down out of it. 2, having a conversation with them directly, because what for you feels like aggression to them might feel like passion, right? Or to them might feel like being a direct, efficient communicator, whereas to you it feels kind of scary and targeted. So it could just be a communication difference and they might not be aware of the impact that they're having. If someone came to me and said that I was behaving in a way that felt really aggressive in a meeting, I'd be devastated. Like that would be great feedback because I would never have thought that I showed up like that. Or maybe have that conversation with someone senior who can kind of interrupt. Alternatively, you might want to do some work around prepping for those meetings, like having some comments you can respond with. Even in the moment, if you wanted to call them out and say, Jason, I'm going to stop you there. You're raising the volume of your voice. It's making me uncomfortable. Are you okay to continue, or do we need to adjourn the meeting so that you can calm down? That's quite a confrontational thing to say. You might not feel comfortable doing that, but in the moment, if you can kind of snap them back into going, oh yeah, sorry, like I was getting a bit hit up, or sorry, I'll calm down, that can be useful as well. So yeah, some things for you to choose from there. And again, that Dealing with Difficult People book by Gil Hassan has a really good section on dealing with aggression, which you might find useful. Debbie says, thank you for a very informative session. You're very welcome, Debbie. My pleasure. Do all the tools provided require documentation at the time when they are generally targeting personal behaviour affecting relationships or work processes? It sort of depends. I think documentation is almost always useful because it is a paper trail of whatever has happened. So even if you don't think that it's going to escalate into something in the future, maybe it was a minor conversation, just having a note somewhere that that conversation happened can be really useful, just because you can then look back on it and go, oh, this issue has come up again. Didn't we have a chat about that? Oh, we had a chat about it 3 weeks ago. Okay, like clearly there's an issue here. Or, oh, it was a once-off 6 months ago. Maybe this is another once-off. I'm kind of not super stressed about it. So having that documentation is useful. Whether it's like a full-on transcript of the meeting will depend on whether that's appropriate in the context. But I think the documentation, even if it's just a short note for a short conversation, is really helpful. Also, if something was to happen where that employee, for example, raised a complaint about them being bullied because they're getting so much feedback all the time, if you've had 2 conversations with them over 4 months, you can be like, well, that's an appropriate level of feedback. So I think that they maybe don't have grounds for a complaint. Or if you were to leave the business and another manager was to come in, there's kind of that history of information there. So I would support documentation. I think in terms of how much or how little depends a bit on the context and what's going to be useful. But yeah, generally, if you can document things, it's unusual that in the future we go, I took too many notes. It's more common that we go, oh, God damn it, I really wish I could remember when that conversation happened. So I would err on the side of caution there. Anonymous asks, when I raise an issue with a certain person, they tend to respond defensively and often leads to them getting upset and raising something they are unhappy about, almost in retaliation. Any advice on how to engage with this person successfully? Totally. That's a really tricky one, especially when you're trying to center your problem and then they're kind of raising an issue in response. That defensiveness can be really hard to navigate because they're kind of putting you in the wrong. They're like, well, you never did XYZ thing, and it makes you feel like you're not valid for raising your concern. So the 2 things I would say to do are, if you use that courageous conversation framework, that'll help de-escalate some of the fear that they feel, because kind of built into that are points where you go, you know, what's your side of the story? What's useful for you to hear? Kind of, what do you need from me? And so that'll help them feel heard and like they're not being put on the spot. The other thing you can do is you can just really refuse to engage with whatever the retaliation-y thing is and just deal with the issue that you're fronting. So if it was, you know, to use an example I was speaking to today, I felt really uncomfortable with the way that you spoke over me in that meeting. Can we have a conversation about what's going on? If they come back with, well, I'm really frustrated by how you dealt with an email I sent you 2 weeks ago, you can go, cool, sounds like we need to have a conversation about that email. That sounds good. Let's revisit that. When would suit you to have a time about my frustrations about the way that you're dealing with me kind of in meetings? We're going to do that on Monday. Let's have a conversation about the email on Thursday, because it's important that you're feeling heard, but I'm worried that if we talk about both, that's not going to let me get my point across and have me feel heard. You kind of just have to keep pulling them back to the process and not get engaged with the emotion of what's going on. And sometimes a bit of distance is helpful, right? So if you can say to someone, hey, I'm going to give you some feedback. I've observed that when you receive feedback in the past, you tend to get quite defensive and quite het up about it. So what I would like to do is share the feedback with you today. Then I'd like to book in a meeting in 2 days' time or 3 days' time for us to talk about the feedback, because I'm worried that in the moment you will feel hurt and angry with me and won't be able to engage with me productively. I want to give you some space to process your feelings about the feedback, and then we can talk about it kind of calmly and rationally on Thursday. So building a bit of time there can be useful. The other thing is you might want to choose to get their buy-in. So you could say to them, hey, I've got some uncomfortable feedback with you that I'd like to share. Receiving feedback like isn't fun. Like most people don't enjoy receiving uncomfortable feedback. How would you like me to share this with you? Would you like me to do it in person? Would you like me to do it in writing? Do you want me to do it over an email? Do you want some time? Like how would you like to receive this feedback? And once they've said, oh, I want it in writing so I can think about it, you go, great, I will give it to you in writing. And then they have exercised a bit of control over the situation, which would hopefully kind of de-escalate that reactiveness response a little bit. And also, when you then come to talk about it, they won't be able to say defensively or retaliatorily, you were a dick because you shouldn't have emailed me the feedback. You can be like, well, I asked you how you wanted it and you said in writing, so I've given it to you. So you kind of just have to keep pulling them back to process. So my suggestion would be, one, build in some time between feedback. So the feedback here and then kind of talk about it later so that they've had time to calm down and they can get out of their limbic brain, their emotional brain, and come into their kind of calm, rational brain. Ask them how they would like the feedback to be delivered, because that's, you know, that's respectful to give people feedback the way they want it to be given. And the third thing is the other piece I talked about, which has just slipped my mind just now, is to, if they kind of bring something up in retaliation, go, cool, thank you for letting me know. I'm grateful for your feedback. I want us to have a working relationship. Let's book in time to talk about your frustrations about the project or about the email or whatever. I really want to make sure that I'm heard on this thing, and I want to make sure that you're heard on this thing. So let's deal with them separately. Otherwise, we'll both just end up feeling like no one is listening. So those are my suggestions there. Anonymous asks, we're at 2:17, we've gone way over time, so thank you to the 101 people who are still with us. That's amazing. I hope you're getting some value out of the session. We'll do 2 more questions and then we'll wrap up, and then we can get back into our days and have the recording afterwards. So Anonymous asks, how do you deal with a boss who doesn't understand emotional distress and basically tells you to just get on with it when you try to talk to them about it? I don't want it to affect my work, but I'm finding it hard to work with them due to not feeling listened to at work. Thank you, Anonymous. That's a very thoughtful question. This is really hard, because when you have a boss who doesn't have good EQ themselves, right, and so doesn't know how to deal with feelings, or doesn't think people should have feelings and they should just keep their personal life at the door, it can be really hard to get them to engage with you so that your emotional needs are met so that you can be your best self at work. So I would suggest, it sounds like you've tried to have conversations with them already. I would suggest trying to use that Courageous Conversations template if you would feel comfortable, because that might be a slightly different structure, or maybe it'll give them the clarity that they're looking for, which when we're feeling distressed, we're not always good at communicating clearly. So maybe they will feel a bit more reassured that you're being very deliberate about, here's what I want and here's why we're talking about. Maybe that structure will make them feel more comfortable. And kind of see where that gets you. Or alternatively, you may again just need to exit from that relationship and go, okay, I know that I will never get the feeling of feeling listened to from this boss. I'm just not going to get it. So if I have a need to feel listened to at work, where can I meet that need elsewhere? Do I have a colleague who I'm really close with that maybe we can offer a bit of peer support and meet that need for each other? Do I need to access, EAP, or is there a counsellor I can call that I can talk to about some of this, so I feel like I've processed the feelings and I can move forward? Is there journaling? Would that be helpful to kind of get all your cuss words and my fucking boss and get that out so you can show up to work? How can you meet that need elsewhere? Because this person clearly is not going to meet the need for you to feel listened to. So suggestions: try the courageous conversation piece. If that's not going to work, just disengage from that relationship a bit and trust that and know that you'll never get that feeling of being listened to. But then try and meet that need elsewhere, because if that need isn't met, like you say, you'll find it hard to do your best work. You won't want to work with them. You're feeling demotivated because your needs aren't being met. That's kind of the consequence for this boss of the way that they're choosing to engage with you. So if you can meet that need elsewhere, that will help you show up to work in a positive, kind of well-resourced way. Again, ultimately, if that's not going to work for you, you might make a choice to move on and find a workplace with a boss who's more responsive to your requests for engagement in ways that are meaningful to you. And last question from Tony. Kia ora, Tony. Thank you for coming along. A newly appointed manager appears to be bringing baggage from previous settings and casting some interdepartmental us versus them wedges through comments and actions from that manager. We've reconfirmed the importance of our one team culture with them, etc., via a recent courageous conversation. Nice work. Are there any thoughts on following up on this with them? How soon and what format should we use? Great question, Tony. And first of all, massive kudos for dealing with that with them when you saw it happening. It's really easy to let that kind of stuff slip and sort of never get to dealing with it. So well done. That's fantastic work. I think if it appears to be going well, and that this person has taken that feedback on board and is now behaving in a way that better suits your company culture, I would maybe just have a coffee with them, maybe like 6 weeks or 8 weeks out from that conversation, just to say, hey, I just want to check in. I know that we had a courageous conversation, you might use that language, or we had a difficult conversation where we had to give you some feedback about the way that you were kind of setting up us versus them vibes at work. I can see that you've really taken that feedback on board, and that appears to have really shown up in awesome ways. So one, I'm well done, thank you. And secondly, kind of, how's this experience been for you? How are you feeling about it? Is it all cool? Like, did that feedback make sense? And just give them a space to connect back with you, because if we've received uncomfortable feedback, we can feel like we're on the out, right? We can feel like we've got a point to prove, like that relationship has weakened between us and the colleague or the boss, whoever's given us the feedback. And having a safe place to kind of reconnect can be really meaningful in terms of going, you're not a bad person and you're not part of a team. We had to give you some feedback. You've responded positively to it. Like, we're all cool, like horses for courses. Let's kind of like move forward. Everything's fine. If it's not going well, you may need to have a conversation with them sooner. So that might be like a 2 weekly check-in with them. Maybe if you have a monthly whip, you can bring it up in that context. But the important thing is to, whatever frequency you choose, is to reinforce the message that that behavior is not acceptable. And if you see examples of behavior that is what you want to see, bring those examples to the table and praise them for it. Or if you see examples of the behavior that's the us versus them kind of wedging apart, call those out and say, hey, remember what we talked about, the one team vibe? I wasn't super happy with how you managed this meeting and how you took on feedback from the other department. What do we need to do so that this can be managed differently next time? But it sounds like the conversation went well. It sounds like it's kind of, it appears to be going well. You haven't said that they threw their toys or anything. So just that reinforcement piece and giving them a safe space to reconnect and feel like it's safe to come back into the tent if they feel like they're on the out. If it's not going well, whatever that reinforcement needs to be to remind them of what is and isn't okay, I think would be my recommendations there. Definitely keep an eye on it, but it sounds like you're across the situation. And again, well done for having that conversation with them in the first place. Cool. There are many comments and questions here that I haven't been able to get to, so thank you so much for your questions. I'm very sorry that I wasn't able to get through all of them. What I will do is do my best to take some screenshots of what came through here and maybe put it in an anonymous document to share afterwards. I really, again, appreciate the time and vulnerability that you've taken to share your examples, and I want to make sure that I'm returning to them. But thank you, everyone. We're at 2:23. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. The recording will come around as will questions, as will the slides and the documents there with those books I recommended in the slides as well. If you do want to book in time with me, again, to continue the conversation here, or if it sparks something that you want to address, book in a meeting time with me using that link in the follow-up email. And I very much look forward to continuing the conversation. But thank you again, and I look forward to seeing you at the next session. Have a wonderful afternoon.